Hey, what's going on, everybody? All right, of all these videos I've been doing, I gotta say I think I'm the most worked up for this one. So I'm gonna try to control myself and keep the swearing to a minimum, which, for those of you who know me well, know I'm not always great at doing. So the title for today's video is "The Great Ron Paul Smeared Again," and I lifted this title from an article that Scott Horton, the great Scott Horton, put out the other day. So yeah, I stole that title, but us ANCAPs, we don't really believe in intellectual property, so I think I'm going to be okay on this one. But I am going to link to Scott Horton's article in the description, so I would highly recommend people go read that after you're done with the video. And I recommend all of Scott Horton's work, so start with that. And if you're not familiar with him, then start reading all of his other stuff. Okay, so you may have heard Ron Paul is being attacked by all types of media outlets over the last 24 hours because a staffer of his who is running his Twitter page tweeted out an image with it was like an image of cultural Marxism with some offensive drawings of minorities, and then they deleted it immediately after and said it was a mistake and they didn't mean to tweet out that image, and they didn't realize that it was like racially insensitive. So if you're a normal person or you have any semblance of sanity, you might be thinking to yourself like, okay, this is really not a big deal. They made a mistake and then deleted it and acknowledged that it's a mistake. However, if you are in the mainstream media, then of course this is proof that Ron Paul is an evil bigot, just like we've always known. I mean, sure, there's nothing he's ever said that would indicate that he's a bigot, nothing he's ever written that would indicate he was a bigot, but I mean, after all, 30 years ago when the guy was practicing medicine, somebody who was writing for his newsletter wrote some insensitive things, and now somebody who ran his Twitter posted an insensitive image. So proof, there you go. Ron Paul, evil bigot, and he's just been hiding it all these years. Of course, there's absolutely nothing that Ron Paul has ever said or stood for that you could even imagine to be slightly racist. But of course, I'm sure he's just hiding it. I mean, that must be what the commonly held belief is. So Dr. Ron Paul, who has been the most fearless politician in modern American history. Dr. Ron Paul basically got famous. I mean, he was a doctor who delivered thousands of babies. He's a family man who's been married to the same woman who he still adores for, I think, 60-something years. But this guy, and then he was a congressman and a relatively unknown congressman. And he got famous because in the 2007, it was for the 2008 campaign, and in 2007, in one of the first debates, he took on Rudy Giuliani, and he gave the Republican base, the George W. Bush Republican base, what was the harshest dose of medicine that you could possibly imagine, which was that, oh, you know what, the terrorists who you're all running around blaming for everything, well, actually, they're responding, and who actually started this fight was the military, who you can't stop praising. Yeah, they were actually the ones who started this fight, and if the military hadn't done what they've done, we wouldn't be dealing with this terrorist problem to begin with. So this guy who is famous for like pure courage and honesty and saying exactly what he believes, and at risk, if he's going to get booed out of the building, doesn't matter. And he would do this over and over again in the Republican debates. He would just give him a dose of the harshest medicine imaginable, and it doesn't matter if he's going to get booed out of the stage. And sometimes he did. Sometimes he got booed out and was just like, okay, that's fine. I'm going to tell the truth. But that same guy who will risk getting booed out of anywhere, he's been keeping this other dark secret that he's a real racist. He's just never said anything to indicate it. In fact, he's gone out of his way many times to say how abhorrent racism is. He said that Martin Luther King is a hero of his because his message was consistent with individuality and civil disobedience. He's said many times that racism is really just an ugly form of collectivism, and he believes that it's impossible for a true individualist libertarian authoritarian, to be racist. But despite all of that, he was always really holding on to these bigoted views, and I guess he's dog whistling his audience. It is just this really effective dog whistling. 30 years ago, he'll have somebody write something under his newsletter while he's practicing medicine, and now he comes out with an offensive cartoon. This is all muhaha, part of Ron Paul's plan, right? Look, I've met Ron Paul. I've had the privilege of talking to him for hours. I also talked to him about a lot of different things, like the plight of Jews in Europe in the 20th century. And I've been interviewed by Ron Paul. I've interviewed Ron Paul on my podcast, and as anybody who knows the guy would tell you, the idea that this guy has a hateful bone in his body is just patently absurd. And I'm somebody who's not only met the man and interviewed the man and been interviewed by him. I've read every one of his books and the vast majority of the articles that he's written. Maybe not the majority, because the guy writes a ton. But there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing there. And it's just really interesting that all these media outlets who ignore Ron Paul, they've made a living out of ignoring Ron Paul for years. All of a sudden, he's one tweet that's immediately taken down away from them all, knowing exactly what he's doing. So all of them. So I saw Chris Cuomo over on CNN did a piece on Ron Paul, did a rant about, I think he called it racist BS, the tweet that Ron Paul's staffer put out the other day, and then he connected it to I guess a couple of recent incidents where white women have called the cops on black people. And I guess there's a connection there. Of course, if you actually look into anything that Ron Paul has ever stood for and believed, Ron Paul's always opposed the state and always opposed the militarism of the police and he's always opposed all non-violent crimes. He was not only a champion against the war on drugs, but he would stand up for things like your right to drink raw milk. I mean, anytime an agent of the state was coming in to arrest someone for a non-violent crime, Ron Paul was right there to speak out against it, and way before it was popular to do so, by the way. Like in the 90s, in the 80s and the 90s, when the Black Congressional Caucus was calling for more police and ramping up the war on drugs in black neighborhoods, Ron Paul was out there speaking against it. Maybe that's part of the reason why the left is so hostile toward Ron Paul, and they really need it to be the case that he's a bigot somewhere, even though there's no real evidence of it. They always need that to be the case because, otherwise people might listen to Ron Paul's message and they might realize that, oh, wow, this guy who's the most conservative man on the planet, who's a country doctor, who's been married to the same woman for 60 years or whatever, and, this guy, it turns out he's actually way better than us on the most important issues. Issues like the police, prisons, war, banker bailouts. Oh yeah, Ron Paul was on the right side of all that shit. Oh yeah, Ron Paul stood up in the House in 2003 and precisely predicted the economic crisis that was going to come due to the subprime mortgage industry. Oh yeah, he got that completely right. Oh yeah, Ron Paul also predicted exactly what a disaster the war in Iraq was going to be and exactly what disasters spreading these wars throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa. Predicted all of that right. So, the two most important issues of our time, the wars and the boom bust, the huge economic crash. Ron Paul was completely right about all of those things. But nobody in the mainstream media seems to want to take him on because there's nothing to take on there. But now they've got him. This is the really important issue, is that, an offensive cartoon was tweeted and then deleted shortly after. And then they acknowledged that they made a mistake. So, it's, by the way, it's really amazing to watch CNN paying attention to Ron Paul because of an offensive cartoon that was tweeted, while CNN, Ron Paul was out there, as I said, being the presidential candidate who got the two most important issues right, predicted them right, and was on the right side of them all the way through, had the most consistent voting record. He was out drawing crowds of thousands of young people, breaking fundraising records, raising more money from active duty military than all the other candidates combined in both 2008 and 2012. And CNN didn't find anything newsworthy about that. I'm also going to link in the description to my favorite piece that Jon Stewart ever did on The Daily Show, where he just goes through the whole media ignoring Ron Paul during his campaign. So there you go. That's they ignore him all the time until there's one screw up, and then all of a sudden this is what they want to talk about. All of a sudden, Ron Paul's relevant again in these guys' mind. What a joke! What a joke all these guys are. I mean, I don't even know how you can be such a professional hack and not even think to yourself like, oh man, yeah, this is maybe this isn't quite as important as all those other issues that he stood for that he was absolutely right about. And on top of that, of course, because the mainstream media taking a shot at him isn't enough, Reason Magazine, who just always seems to be thrilled to jump on the bash Ron Paul train, which, seems a little bit strange, seeing as how they're supposed to be a libertarian publication, and Ron Paul has, without argument, done more for the libertarian movement in the last 30 years than any other public figure. Absolutely no question about that. But whenever there's an opportunity to bash him, they always seem to really, really love to jump on that train. So Brian Doherty wrote a piece, and Brian Doherty, I will say, he's good sometimes, but man, when he's bad, it is really freaking embarrassing. And so he wrote a piece, and he said, Ron Paul slams cultural Marxism with a quickly deleted bigoted cartoon. Why an attack on cultural Marxism isn't compatible with the fight for liberty. All right, so look, I told you I linked to Scott Horton's article, and I really recommend everybody read that. I thought it was a great piece. The one part of Scott's article that I might disagree with is that he basically says we should stop using the term cultural Marxism and stop going after it, because he says, people don't really, no one really identifies as a cultural Marxist, and basically the term is taken in the wrong way. And, I understand his point, but I think I disagree slightly with him on that. The idea of attacking cultural Marxism, right, which is kind of like an attack on the Frankfurt School, and the broader idea of cultural Marxism is that there were these certain Marxists who wanted to transition away from traditional Marxism and from the kind of economic point of view. So Karl Marx basically said that all of history is defined as a class struggle, and the classes were economic classes. So you had the working class, the proletariat, versus the oppressing class, the bourgeois. And the proletariat were oppressed, and the bourgeois were the oppressors. And what cultural Marxism, the idea of it, was that you would switch this around to like a cultural dynamic. So you still always see everything as oppressor versus oppressed. And instead of it being the working class versus the bourgeois, it could be like, white people versus black people, or straight people versus gay people, or men versus women. And, call that whatever you want to, but it's got to be acknowledged. I don't know. Have any of you guys looked around our culture? Have you seen all the people who are the biggest statists? I mean, seems to kind of permeate every aspect of the mainstream and the left, the idea of, say, white privilege, of victim complex, of LGBT rights, of all this stuff. I mean, this has to be taken on. So, yeah, is it a little bit sloppy to just kind of... Yes, do some people get the impression that you're saying that the Frankfurt School actually took over the entire world, and that they're the ones running the show, and they're sitting in a smoky room somewhere around a long table, plotting on how to take down the West? Okay, sure, that's not exactly accurate, but yeah, these ideas have really taken off, okay? And they're all around us, and I don't see what's crazy about, addressing that or fighting back against it. So call it whatever you want to, but yeah, I think it's worth pointing out. And for Brian Doherty, who's a libertarian, who writes at a libertarian publication, to say that an attack on cultural Marxism is not compatible with a fight for liberty. I mean, this is profoundly stupid. Profoundly stupid. First of all, in terms of being compatible with libertarianism, there's nothing that is incompatible with libertarianism other than violating the non-aggression principle, violating property rights, or calling for a violation of the non-aggression principle. Those are the only things that are incompatible with libertarianism, okay? Anything other than that has nothing to do with libertarianism, period. That's what it is. Okay? To say that it's like saying that liking French fries is incompatible with being an abolitionist. Has nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing to do with it. Okay? If you want the institution of slavery to be abolished, you're an abolitionist. What kind of food you like has nothing to do with that. So any of these other cultural preferences, there's nothing incompatible with liberty about them. Okay? And the idea that Ron Paul is not on the fight for liberty because he tweets out something about cultural Marxism, because he takes a stand against political correctness. I mean, have you looked around at the world we're living in? It's not a coincidence that all the biggest statists amongst us seem to kind of be on the side of political correctness. Okay? And for any of the true progressives out there, which, by the way, Ron Paul has always been happy to work with all those guys on any of the most important issues, like I was talking about before, like police, jail, prison, wars, bailing out bankers, any of these issues, he's always been happy to work on them with. So I'm just trying to wonder, almost just getting back to the Ron Paul thing. What do you think is more likely here, right? What's more likely? That Ron Paul, the guy who you can never find one word he's ever said or one sentence that he's ever written that said anything bigoted or hateful or anti-minority or any of these groups, that this guy, who everybody who knows him would swear up and down doesn't have a hateful bone in his body. So what do you think's more likely? You have scenario A. He's a secret bigot, and even though he'll say the harshest truths that are gonna make him a pariah in every other area, he just won't say anything about this. But he's every 30 years he's dog whistling something. Okay, so what's more likely, that or B, that one of his staffers made a mistake, posted an image that they didn't realize was racially insensitive, and immediately deleted it and said it was a mistake? You tell me. What's more likely? Now, let me say this, okay? And I'll wrap things up in a second. But let's say that the first ridiculous scenario, which is obviously not true, let's just say, for the sake of the matter, it was true, okay? Let's say Ron Paul is a secret bigot, okay? So Ron Paul, you think he's got this underlying bigotry that he just won't talk about. So a bigot, in your mind, has spent his entire career being on the right side of the most important issues. If Ron Paul had had his way, there'd be a whole bunch of black people who are right now thrown in cages to be raped and tortured like animals, okay? They'd all have their freedom. All those black people in cages who committed nonviolent crimes, they'd all have their freedom. And oh, by the way, there'd be millions and millions of brown people in the Middle East and Northern Africa whose lives wouldn't have been ruined. Hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved. Millions of lives wouldn't have been ruined. Entire nations wouldn't have been destroyed. So you've got this bigot who, if we had listened to him, would have saved the lives of all of these people. And on top of that, even though he's such a hateful bigot, he never talks about it. And in fact, what he preaches when he's got the ear of millions of young people, what he tells them is that racism is an ugly form of collectivism, which is basically the worst thing you can be. He tells them that Martin Luther King is a hero to him. Right? That's what this guy is doing. So, man, if he was a bigot, what a great fucking job he's done, huh? He's controlled it and basically told everybody else not to be racist. Of course, that scenario is not true at all. And what you start to realize once you look at it, if you're a sane person, is that, no, Ron Paul, what you see is actually what you get. He's a really kind country doctor who's delivered thousands of babies, who's always fought for what he believes in, and is the greatest champion of liberty in modern times. And screw all these people who are bashing Ron Paul. You know what? I'm almost glad this whole thing happened just so his name can get brought up again. Because you know what all these people are terrified about? And this goes for all these left-wing publications, CNN and The Hill and all these, and it goes for Reason Magazine too. You know what they're scared of? Is that people are actually going to look into the ideas that Ron Paul promoted. They're actually going to look into his philosophy and realize that he's a much smarter, much more principled guy that has a lot more to offer the world than any of them do. All right. That's my video for today. I'll see you guys tomorrow at 3 p.m. Goodbye.